Suck it up, Amelia. It's just a cramp. NHI's voice, laced with the casual cruelty I had grown so accustomed to, cut through the thick fog of my agony. I was on my hands and knees, on the cold kitchen linoleum, a guttural moan tearing from my throat. This was not a cramp. This was a hot, jagged blade twisting deep inside me, a pain so absolute it had its own gravity, pulling me down, down, down. Honestly, the drama. He sighed, the sound of him opening the refrigerator door punctuating his words. My mother pushed out a 10-pound baby and was making dinner an hour later. You modern women are just soft. NHE was talking about his own birth. It was his favorite story, his go-to comparison for every ache, pain, or moment of weakness I had ever displayed. He, Liam, was the product of strength. I, by extension, was the embodiment of frailty. Another wave of pain crashed over me, so violent it stole my breath and blurred my vision. I cried out, a sharp, desperate sound. "Liam, please," I gasped, my forehead pressed against the cool, grimy floor. "Something's wrong. It's too soon. We have to go to the hospital. Now." And I heard him chuckle. It was a low, condescending sound that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. "Here we go. The grand performance. What is it this time? Are you trying to get out of hosting my parents for dinner tomorrow? Because the roast is already defrosting." NHE came around the kitchen island, a bottle of beer in his hand. He nudged my hip with his foot, not a kick, but a casual, dismissive prod, the way you'd move a piece of luggage out of your path. "Get up, Amelia. You're being hysterical." And then my world shattered. A gush of warm fluid soaked through my sweatpants, pooling beneath me. My water hadn't just broken, it had exploded. And with it came an overwhelming, primal urge to push. My body was no longer my own. It was a vessel, and it was ejecting its contents with terrifying force. And I screamed his name, a raw, animalistic sound of pure terror. "Liam!" NHE finally stopped laughing. He looked down, his eyes widening as he saw the fluid spreading across the floor. But the look on his face wasn't concern. It wasn't fear for me or for our unborn children. It was annoyance, disgust, as if I had deliberately made a mess just to inconvenience him. And, "For God's sake, Amelia," he spat, taking a step back to avoid the spreading pool. "Right on the floor? Are you serious?" NMY body convulsed. The first of our babies was coming. Right here, right now. I was screaming, sobbing, begging him to call 911, to help me, to do something. NHE just stood there, leaning against the counter, taking a long, slow sip of his beer. He watched as I, his wife, ripped myself apart on our kitchen floor. And as the first tiny, gasping infant entered the world, he shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "Wow," he said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so profound it felt like acid on my soul. "You're really committing to the bit. Bravo." NHE thought it was an act, a manipulative, hysterical performance. He watched me give birth on the floor, my screams echoing in the suddenly silent house, and he mocked me. He turned my agony into a joke, and in that moment, as another contraction seized me and the cries of my firstborn were drowned out by his derisive laughter, I knew that this was a pain from which I might never recover, not the pain of childbirth, but the pain of knowing the man I had married would watch me die and call it an overreaction. NIF, this story has already gripped you. Please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing. You need to witness how this story of unimaginable cruelty finds its path to justice. Let's continue. NNLIAM wasn't always so openly cruel. In the beginning, his contempt was disguised as a kind of rugged, old-fashioned charm. He was a man's man, a former college football player who now ran his family's successful construction company. He was decisive, confident, and exuded an aura of strength that I, a quiet librarian, found intoxicatingly different from my own world of gentle stories and quiet contemplation. NHE pursued me with a relentless, focused energy. He called it courtship. He saw me as a project, a soft, delicate thing that needed his strength to survive. "You think too much, Amelia," he'd say, tapping my forehead with his finger. "You need someone to pull you out of those books and into the real world." And I mistook his condescension for care. I saw his dismissal of my anxieties as a sign of his own unshakable stability. My parents were wary. "He seems to think he knows what's best for you more than you do," my father had noted, his brow furrowed. But I was in love, convinced that his brand of tough love was exactly what I needed. We married, and I moved into the large, imposing house he had built, a house that felt more like his monument to himself than our shared home. The first cracks in the foundation of our marriage appeared quickly. They were small things, hairline fractures of disrespect. He'd tell embarrassing stories about me at dinner parties, framing my sensitivity as a humorous flaw. Amelia once cried during a car insurance commercial. He'd announced to a table of his laughing friends, while I sat there, my face burning with humiliation. NHE called my pain drama. When I had my wisdom teeth removed and was in genuine agony, he told me to stop milking it. When I came down with a severe flu, he sighed with exasperation as if my illness was a personal affront to him. He had a hierarchy of suffering, and at the top was the stoic, silent endurance of men, specifically the men in his family. Any complaint from me was a sign of weakness, a character flaw he was determined to either mock or ignore out of existence. When I got pregnant, his behavior intensified. He was thrilled, not with the prospect of a child, but with the prospect of a son. A little linebacker, he'd crow, patting my still flat stomach. "We need to toughen him up from the start." No coddling. NTHE pregnancy was difficult. I was diagnosed with hyperemesis gravidarum, a severe form of morning sickness that left me weak and constantly dehydrated. To Liam, this wasn't a medical condition. It was a personal failing. "My mother never had morning sickness," he'd say, as if it were a matter of willpower. "It's all in your head, Amelia. You're letting it win." NTHE day we found out we were having octuplets was the day his contempt began to curdle into something darker. The doctor was stunned, speaking in hushed, serious tones about the extreme risks, the need for a team of specialists, the likelihood of a very premature birth. And I was terrified, overwhelmed, but also felt a flicker of awe. 8 babies. 8 tiny souls. NLIAM was silent during the entire consultation. He just stared at the ultrasound screen, his jaw tight. When we got to the car, he turned to me, his eyes cold and hard. "You did this," he said, his voice low and menacing. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my heart pounding. "How could I have done this?" "You and your weak body," he sneered. "It couldn't even handle one pregnancy properly, so it just malfunctioned. Fired off 8 at once like a broken machine gun. This is your fault." From that day on, I wasn't his wife carrying his children. I was a defective vessel, a source of shame and immense inconvenience. He refused to attend any more doctor's appointments. "I'm not sitting in a room full of nervous women talking about their feelings," he'd scoff. "I have a business to run." NHE became obsessed with the gender. He was convinced, with a certainty that bordered on delusion, that they would all be boys. 8 sons. An army to carry on his name, a testament to his own virility. He refused to even entertain the possibility of daughters. When I tried to gently suggest we pick out some girls, names, he cut me off. "Don't bother. Won't need them." NTHE final ultrasound, the one that confirmed the genders, was a day I will never forget. I went alone. The technician confirmed it. 8 girls. I felt a wave of terror so profound it made me dizzy. This news would not just disappoint him, it would enrage him. It was the ultimate proof of my body's failure to produce what he had ordered. I couldn't bring myself to tell him. I lied. I told him it was too early to tell for sure. I lived in a state of quiet, constant dread, my massive belly a ticking time bomb. I knew that when the truth came out, the explosion would be devastating. I just never imagined it would happen on our kitchen floor, with my screams of agony serving as the soundtrack to his amusement. NTHE world narrowed to the grimy pattern of the linoleum tiles and the searing, relentless pain that was tearing me apart. Time became meaningless. There was only the before, when I was a whole person, and the now, this horrifying, surreal theater of cruelty, where I was the sole performer and my husband was the jeering audience. One after another, they came. Tiny, impossibly fragile, their skin translucent and their cries thin and reedy. With the birth of each daughter, a new layer of my sanity peeled away. I was operating on some primal, animal instinct, trying to clear their airways, trying to wrap them in the dish towels I could reach from the floor, my movements clumsy and slick with blood and fluid. And through it all, Liam watched. NHE didn't help. He didn't call for an ambulance. He documented. He pulled out his phone, the screen's glow casting an eerie light on his face. "You've got to see this, Jerry," he said, his voice casual as he spoke to his best friend. "Amelia's putting on a real show. Yeah, right here on the kitchen floor. I'm telling you, it's better than cable." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "She's screaming like she's in an exorcism movie. It's hilarious." NHE was live narrating my trauma, turning the most vulnerable moment of my life into a locker room joke for his friends. The humiliation was a pain sharper than any contraction. He wasn't just ignoring my suffering, he was broadcasting it, mocking it, reveling in it. "How many is that now?" he asked, peering over the island as if counting widgets on an assembly line. 4? 5? All girls, right? Figures." And I was sobbing, begging, the words a meaningless jumble of "please God help me." I was losing a tremendous amount of blood. The room was starting to tilt, the edges of my vision going dark and fuzzy. I was dying. I knew it with a terrifying certainty. And my last sight on this earth would be my husband, leaning against the counter, smirking. NBY the time the 8th baby was born, I was barely conscious. I was lying in a spreading pool of my own blood, surrounded by my 8 premature daughters. Some were crying. Some were terrifyingly still. And it was the silence that finally seemed to penetrate his bubble of arrogant detachment. The silence of the babies who were no longer crying. The silence of my own ragged breaths growing shallower in panic, or perhaps just the inconvenience of having to deal with a dead body, finally flickered in his eyes. All right, the joke's over," he said, his voice losing some of its bravado. "Amelia, get up. This isn't funny anymore." And I couldn't answer. I could only look at him, my eyes pleading. With a heavy, put-upon sigh, he finally put his phone down. He didn't rush to my side. He didn't check on the babies. He walked over to the sink, washed his hands meticulously, and then, finally, dialed 911. I heard his side of the conversation in disjointed fragments. "Yeah, my wife. She's being dramatic. I think she had the babies. On the floor. Yeah, she made a real mess." NHE didn't say she was bleeding out. He didn't say the babies were premature and struggling to breathe. He reported it like he was reporting a spill in a supermarket aisle. NTHE. Last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me whole was his face looming over me. He wasn't looking at me with concern. He was looking with a kind of morbid curiosity, the way a child might poke a dead bird with a stick. "And weak," he whispered, the word a final, damning verdict. "I always knew you were weak." Then everything went black, and I woke up in the ICU to the steady, rhythmic beeping of machines that were keeping me alive. The world was a sterile, white blur. A kind-faced doctor with tired eyes stood by my bed. "Amelia," she said gently, "you're very lucky. You lost a catastrophic amount of blood. We had to perform an emergency hysterectomy. It was the only way to save you." NTHE words barely registered. My mind was a fog of trauma and anesthesia. "My babies," I rasped, my throat raw. "Are they?" "7 of your daughters survived," she said, her voice soft with a compassion that felt like a foreign language after Liam's cruelty. They are fighters, every single one of them. They're in the NICU, and they are holding their own. N7, not 8. A sob tore through me, a sound of such profound loss it felt like it was ripping my stitches. One of my daughters was gone before I ever had the chance to hold her, to name her. Her death was a direct result of his delay, his mockery, his inaction. He hadn't just mocked my pain, he had murdered my child with his contempt. And the 8th? I whispered, already knowing the answer. She didn't make it, honey, the doctor said, her hand resting on my arm. She lost too much oxygen. If the call had come just 10 minutes sooner, she trailed off, her meaning hanging in the air, heavy and damning. A cold, hard fury began to burn through my grief. It was a rage so pure and so potent, it felt like it was cauterizing my wounds from the inside out. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice like ice. "Where is my husband?" NTHE doctor's expression hardened. "The police are waiting to speak with you. They have him in custody." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Amelia." The paramedics who arrived at the scene, they were horrified. They said your husband was unconcerned. He was complaining about the mess on the floor while they were trying to resuscitate your children. She continued, her voice low. "He told the police that you were hysterical, that you refused to go to the hospital, and that you gave birth on the floor as some sort of manipulative act. He's trying to say this is your fault. NTHE audacity of it. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it took my breath away. But then the doctor handed me a small plastic bag. It was my phone. One of the paramedics found it on the kitchen counter," she said. "It was still on. It seems your husband," he pocket-dialed his friend Jerry. The call went to voicemail. It recorded for over 20 minutes. The police have it now. They let me listen to a part of it. Amelia, it recorded everything. Neverything. His laughter, his jokes, his derisive commentary, his utter disregard for my life and the lives of our children. It wasn't just my word against his anymore. It was his own voice, his own words, convicting him. NTHE voicemail was not just evidence. It was a verdict. It was the sound of his cruelty, captured and preserved for the world to hear. He had thought he was performing for an audience of one. He had no idea that his theater of cruelty had been recorded for a jury. An NTHE voicemail changed everything. It transformed the case from a tragic domestic dispute into a clear-cut, horrifying story of criminal negligence and depraved indifference. Liam's narrative of the hysterical, manipulative wife crumbled in the face of his own recorded voice. He was denied bail. The story and excerpts of the chilling audio were leaked to the press, and a firestorm of public outrage erupted. NHE was no longer Liam Evans, the strong, successful businessman. He was the monster of the kitchen floor, the man who laughed while his wife and children were dying. While the legal storm raged, I began my own long, painful recovery. Physically, I was weak, but my spirit was hardening into something unbreakable. My fight was no longer just for me. It was for the daughter I had lost, and for the 7 tiny, fierce souls fighting for their lives in the NICU. Named them: strength, valor, honor, grace, hope, faith, and serenity. I named my lost daughter Justice NMY. Parents, who had been so wary of Liam from the start, became my pillars. My father, a quiet, gentle man, revealed a core of steel I had never seen. He handled the media, hired a fierce, brilliant prosecutor, and shielded me from the worst of the storm. My mother moved into my hospital room, sleeping on a cot, refusing to leave my side. NBUT, the most unexpected support came from a chorus of women I had never met. The nurses in the ICU and the NICU. They were warriors, all of them. They had seen the worst of humanity, and they recognized true evil when they saw it. They became my protectors, my confidants, my army. They would whisper words of encouragement as they checked my vitals. They would sit with me for hours by the incubators, explaining every beep and reading with infinite patience. They shared stories of their own struggles, their own battles against men who had tried to diminish them. "Weakness is not feeling pain, Amelia," a veteran nurse named Carol told me one night, her hand on my shoulder. "Weakness is deriving pleasure from the pain of others. You are the strongest person in this hospital." These women, who saw strength in suffering every day, refused to let me believe Liam's final whispered verdict. They redefined strength for me. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the courage to face it. It wasn't stoic silence, but the will to survive and fight. When I was finally discharged, I couldn't go back to that house. It was a crime scene, a place of unimaginable trauma. A local women's advocacy group, funded by an outpouring of national donations, found me a new place, a small, sunny rental house with a garden. They helped me furnish it, set up the 7 cribs, and filled the pantry. NTHE Day, I brought my daughters home, one by one, was a day of quiet, solemn victory. The house was filled with the sounds of my 7 tiny miracles. It was chaotic and overwhelming, but it was a chaos born of life, not of cruelty. And I was not alone. I was surrounded by a chorus of the strong, my parents, the nurses who had become my friends, the women from the advocacy group, and the 7 tiny, resilient girls who were living proof of my strength. We were an army of our own, and we were ready for the war that was coming. An NTHE trial was a media circus. Liam, having lost his high-priced legal team after the voicemail leak, was represented by a public defender who looked perpetually exhausted. Liam himself had aged a decade. He sat slumped in his chair, the arrogant smirk replaced by a sullen, resentful pout. He looked like what he was, a bully who had been caught. The prosecution, led by a sharp, relentless DA named Isabella Rossi, built an airtight case. They played the voicemail for the jury. The courtroom fell into a stunned, horrified silence, broken only by the sound of a juror's gasp, and Liam's mother sobbing in the front row. Hearing his voice again, his casual cruelty echoing in the solemn chamber, was like reliving the trauma all over again. But this time, I was not on the floor. I was sitting tall, my gaze fixed on the jury, letting them hear the truth in his own words. NTHE paramedics testified, their voices shaking with anger as they described the scene, Liam's nonchalance, his complaints about the mess. The doctors testified, explaining in cold, clinical detail how his delay had directly led to the death of my daughter, Justice, and had nearly cost me my own life. And then, it was my turn, and I walked to the stand, my body still aching, but my resolve absolute. I did not need to be hysterical or emotional. I just needed to tell the truth. Rossi led me through the story of our marriage, of his constant belittling, his dismissal of my pain, his obsession with strength. "Mrs. Evans," Rossi said, her voice gentle but firm, "your husband's defense is that he panicked, that the sight of a home birth was so traumatic that he was not in his right mind. Is that what you saw in his eyes that night? Panic?" And I looked at the jury, my voice clear and steady. "No, I saw annoyance. I saw contempt. And then, when he realized I was in real agony, I saw amusement. He thought it was funny. My pain was his entertainment." NTHE defense attorney's cross-examination was feeble. He tried to paint me as an unreliable narrator, but he had nothing to counter the chilling evidence of the voicemail. NHI's last-ditch effort was to put Liam on the stand. It was a catastrophic mistake. Under Rossi's merciless questioning, his composure shattered. His narrative of being a panicked, overwhelmed husband fell apart, revealing the arrogant, cruel man beneath. "You called her weak, didn't you, Mr. Evans?" Rossi pressed, her voice like steel. "As she was lying on the floor, bleeding to death, your last word to her was, 'weak.' She was always complaining, always crying about something," he burst out, his face red with fury. "I was trying to toughen her up. That's what a husband is supposed to do." NTHE outburst sealed his fate. The jury saw him for exactly what he was. Not a man who had panicked, but a man whose philosophy of strength was nothing more than a pathetic excuse for his own profound cruelty and lack of empathy. NMY body was covered in scars from the C-section and the hysterectomy. They were a permanent testament to that night. But as I sat there, listening to him condemn himself with his own words, I realized my greatest scars were not the ones on my skin. They were the ones on my soul. And my testimony, my truth, was the first step in letting them heal. NNTHE jury was out for less than 30 minutes. It was a formality. The entire courtroom was tense as they filed back in, their faces grim and resolved. NTHE foreman, a burly man who looked like he could have been one of Liam's football buddies, stood and cleared his throat. He refused to look at Liam. His eyes found mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw a look of profound sympathy and respect. NHE read the verdict. On the charge of criminally negligent homicide for the death of the infant known as Justice Evans, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Strangled sob escaped Liam's mother. On the 7 charges of felony child endangerment, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault against his wife, Amelia Evans, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all counts. The word echoed in the silent courtroom, a hammer blow of vindication. Liam stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of disbelief. He genuinely seemed to believe that his twisted logic, his narrative of my weakness, would somehow absolve him. He had believed his own lies for so long, he couldn't comprehend that the rest of the world saw the plain, ugly truth. And at the sentencing a week later, the judge, a stern woman with a reputation for being tough but fair, delivered a speech that I will never forget. NSHE looked directly at Liam, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. Mr. Evans, you have built your entire identity around a warped, cartoonish idea of strength. You seem to believe that strength is the absence of expressed pain, the suppression of emotion. You are profoundly mistaken. NSHE gestured towards me. Strength is a woman surviving a trauma that would have broken most people. Strength is a woman fighting for her life so she can be there for her children. Strength is 7 premature infants clinging to life in an incubator. Strength is the compassion of the paramedics, nurses, and doctors who saved them from your catastrophic failure as a husband, a father, and a human being. NHER voice dropped, becoming quiet and deadly. You are not strong, Mr. Evans. You are a coward. Your mockery of your wife's agony was not a sign of your strength, but of your own pathetic weakness and moral rot. You did not mock her because you are strong. You mocked her because you are a small, cruel man who enjoys the suffering of others because it makes you feel powerful. NSHE sentenced him to the maximum consecutive term for each charge. He would spend decades in prison. He would be an old, forgotten man before he ever saw the outside of a cell. And as they led him away in handcuffs, he looked at me. His eyes were not filled with remorse. They were filled with a burning, impotent rage. He was still convinced he was the victim. I felt nothing. No pity. No satisfaction. Just a quiet, profound sense of closure. The gavel had fallen, and its echo was the sound of justice, finally, being served. NTHE years that followed were not easy, but they were ours. We built a life not on a foundation of contempt, but on a bedrock of love, resilience, and mutual respect. My 7 daughters, strength, valor, honor, grace, hope, faith, and serenity, grew into 7 remarkable, compassionate, and incredibly strong young women, and our house was loud. It was filled with laughter, arguments, music, and the constant chaotic energy of 7 vibrant lives. I ran a small, independent bookstore, a quiet haven where I could share my love of stories with the community that had saved me. And WE never pretended the trauma didn't happen. We talked about it. We had a small memorial for justice in our garden, a beautiful cherry blossom tree that exploded in a riot of pink, delicate flowers every spring. Her memory was not a source of pain, but a reminder of what we were fighting for. I taught my daughters that strength was not the absence of tears, but the courage to feel. I taught them that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a superpower. I taught them that true strength was found in kindness, in empathy, and in the way we lift each other up. One afternoon, when the girls were teenagers, I was having a difficult day. The bookstore was struggling, bills were piling up, and I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling on my shoulders. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my head in my hands, when my daughter Strength, my eldest by 3 minutes, came in, and SHE didn't say anything. She just started making me a cup of tea. Then Valor came in and started rubbing my shoulders. Soon, all 7 of them were there, surrounding me, offering quiet comfort, a shared snack, a silly joke. They had built a fortress of love around me. I looked up at their beautiful, concerned faces, and I started to cry. Not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I'm sorry," I sniffled, wiping my eyes. "I'm just having a weak moment." Strength, my fierce, wonderful daughter, knelt in front of me and took my hands. She looked me straight in the eye, her gaze steady and full of a love that mirrored the judge's words from so long ago. "No, Mom," she said, her voice firm and clear. "You're not having a weak moment. You're having a human moment. And you're the strongest person we know." In that instant, the last of Liam's poison, his final whispered verdict of weak, dissolved forever. He had been wrong about everything. He had tried to define me by my pain, but my children had redefined me by my love. He had left me for dead on the kitchen floor, but we had not just survived, we had thrived. We had taken his ugly, twisted definition of strength and we had rewritten it. And our version, written in the ink of tears, laughter, and unbreakable love, was the only one that mattered.